Hello, special extra episode. Aaron asks, what causes cancer? As in, how do carcinogens consistently cause DNA mutations that lead to cancer? So this is an interesting question, so I want to discuss it in excruciating detail. So we're made out of a lot of cells, and they're really tiny. They're so tiny, in fact, that to see them, you need to take a magnifying glass, a really strong one, and you need to take a second magnifying glass, a really strong one, and you need to put them together so you have two of them on top of each other, and even then the cells are pretty small. That's what we call a microscope. We are made of billions of them. And the number, the sheer huge number, is an important factor in the number of cells we're made of is important in the formation of cancer. So one thing that cells do is that they divide, right? So if we're made, they start out like this, right? And they have secret instructions inside of them, that's what DNA is, that tells them to divide. And so they get really big, and then they sort of do this kind of thing, and suddenly you have two cells. And then inside of the one cell, the DNA will double itself, and then it'll get a little bit bigger as it starts to grow after the DNA has doubled itself, and then it'll pinch in two, and then so on and so forth. And this keeps happening. And that's what we call the cell cycle. So there's the part of the cell cycle where the DNA is doubling, there's the part where it divides, and then there's the part where the DNA is just sitting there, not doubling, and the cell is just doing its thing. So the DNA is the instructions for not just how the cell divides, but so the DNA is instructions for RNA. RNA is the instructions for protein. Now DNA and RNA are just boring strings, but protein is like a knot with some really interesting chemical properties. So proteins do a lot of different things. They're the thing that reads DNA in order to make RNA. They're the thing that drive the cell cycle forward. They're the things that tell the cell cycle to stop when it's going too fast. Insulin, you've probably heard of, is a protein. Hemoglobin is a protein. A lot of the chemicals they're looking for when they do blood labs are proteins. Proteins can do all sorts of crazy different kinds of things. And they're all different from each other, which is why we need instructions for each different one, and DNA is where the instructions for making them are. Cancer, you may be aware, is when the cells start dividing too much too quickly without stopping. And that's a problem because it takes energy for your cells to divide, and when cancer starts dividing like crazy, it starts taking up all of your energy that you would ordinarily do for living, and that's a problem. It also, and that's how it kills you, is it starts eating all your food, kind of like a parasite. But it also can kill you by, if you've got one in, an important spot, if you have one right next to the artery that's feeding your brain, then it, blocks the artery and you don't get blood in your brain, and that's a problem. Or they can block up tubes and other spaces. So those are the two main ways cancer will kill you. It's by eating all your food like a parasite, and by blocking important tubes. So there are proteins that tell the cell, continue dividing, and there are proteins that say, stop dividing. So when the proteins that say, continue dividing, start to get overactive, that's a problem. And when the proteins that say, stop dividing, get overactive, if the proteins that say stop get underactive, that can be a problem. So why would the proteins start doing this, start acting all out of whack? Well, the instructions for the proteins are in the DNA. So if the DNA changes, the fancy word is mutate, sometimes that changes the protein that the DNA makes. So if it's a stop protein, maybe when its instructions change, the stop protein, instead of being this really complicated ball, is just this little bit of string that can't do anything anymore. So that might be how the stop protein doesn't work. Or maybe one of the go proteins gets a mutation that says go faster, or that makes the protein say go faster. So carcinogens work in basically two ways, right? So the DNA is a chemical. So some carcinogens are chemicals that will do chemistry with the DNA. And when you do chemistry with the DNA, it changes. And sometimes when it changes, the instructions change. And that can be one way that cancer can happen, is if chemistry happens to the DNA. The other way is every time a cell divides, there is a chance, just a random chance, that it will accumulate a mutation, or the DNA will change just by the act of the cell dividing. So any chemical that causes cells to die more often means that the cells around the dead cells have to divide to replace their dead comrade. So anything that kills cells is going to have to make cells divide more often, which means mutations are going to happen more often. Now, one mutation generally isn't enough to cause cancer, right? Because you have dozens of stop proteins, and you have dozens of go proteins, right? So one go protein will only be active after the DNA has doubled, but will stop just as the cell is starting to pinch off, right? So it only controls part of the cycle. So maybe if it changes, just that one part of the cycle will go a little bit faster, but it's not quite cancer. The thing with that is, though, the more mutations a cell accumulates, the faster it divides. The faster it divides, the less careful the cell is in making sure the DNA isn't mutated. So the more mutations you have, the more mutations you're likely to get. Oh, also, viruses and B cells just doing their natural B cell thing can sometimes cause cancer. Human papillomavirus is one virus that can cause cancer, and that's a somewhat different mechanism. The virus is trying to cause cancer, because then it can divide while inside of your cell. So that's a little bit of a unique thing. And the other thing with leukemia or lymphoma, I think it's leukemia, your B cells will try and mutate on purpose when they're trying to come up with new ways to fight off foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses. So that's a thing that can happen in kids, mostly. That's just a little bit weird, and it doesn't fit the other ways that cancer usually happens. Just want to throw that in there. Anyway, so most mutations don't cause cancer. They either kill the cell, or cause it to die in some way, or they do nothing, right? A huge chunk of your DNA is just there structural, right? It's kind of like if you built a library out of books, and the books just had gibberish inside of them. The library has information in it, but the bookshelves and the library itself are just made out of books, because that's the building material that you have. That's kind of how DNA is. So, right, if you were to change the gibberish in one of the structural books of the library, it wouldn't change what's in the library. So you need to have the mutation happen in the part of the DNA that has instructions for a protein. It can't be one of the... Well, it can occasionally be in the structural, but that's a more complicated thing I don't need to talk about. So it has to be specifically... The mutations have to be in a specific place, which means a lot of mutations don't do anything. They're just there as a mutation. And a lot of mutations will cause the cell to not be able to live anymore, and the cell will just die. Or the cell won't be able to, it'll be able to be alive, but it'll stop dividing. That's the fancy word for when a cell is not dividing anymore but is still alive, is senescence. Senescence is actually a protective factor against cancer. So if most mutations don't cause cancer, well, how does cancer happen? Well, it turns out mutations are per, bit of DNA, they're pretty rare. But per cell, because your cell has like lots of DNA inside of it, per cell, mutations aren't that rare. I don't know if it's like all of the cells in your body have a mutation or just like a lot of them have a mutation. But mutations in DNA are, not that rare. And if you have 1 billion cells, odds are one of them is going to have the mutation in just the wrong spot. And that's part of why people who have lived for more years are more likely to get cancer, is because their cells have just had a longer time to make a certain type of mistake, right? And it only takes one cell in your whole body to accumulate exactly the right mutations, because once you get one cancerous cell, just one out of billions, it divides into 2 cancerous cells, and 3, and then 4, and then 8, and then 16. So if any one of the billions of cells that you have accumulates mutations in exactly the right spots, that's enough. It's also worth noting that you're more likely to get cancer in the types of cells that divide more often, right? Because if you risk getting a mutation every time a cell divides, the cells that divide more often, are going to have more mutations. And that's why some of the more common cancers would be like colon cancer, because the inside of your colon is constantly like falling off in your poop, and then you have to replace those colon cells. Or your skin keeps falling off, so you have to get, skin cancer is probably something you've heard of. Lung cancer you've probably heard of, right? So, do lung cells divide often? Only if you smoke. If you smoke, you are killing your cells, so they have to divide more often. That's not to say that someone who never smokes never gets lung cancer, but if you don't smoke, it's probably not something you have to worry about. Like, you should worry more about a car accident. Although secondhand smoke can be enough. And not just, like, it killing your cells, but also there are ingredients in cigarettes that do chemistry with your DNA. So it's sort of like a 2-in-1 deal for cancer. Alcohol, maybe you've heard, can cause liver cancer, because alcohol will kill your liver cells, so they have to divide more often. Sunlight is another twofer, right? So it'll kill your skin cells, so they have to divide more often. But the ultraviolet radiation will also do chemistry to your DNA, which causes it to change. Heavy metals like lead is something that can cause mutations because of the way it can do things with electrons at lower energies. Anything that causes free radicals, this is maybe something you've heard of, like antioxidants will protect against free radicals. Those can help. So you might be thinking, oh, well, like if I have cancer, I should have lots of antioxidants, right? No. Because your cancer cells, like once they are mutated and are cancer cells, they need to be protected against free radicals just like your regular cells do. So you don't want to like overdose on vitamin C to cure yourself of cancer. That would actually hurt you. So one thing I want to address is like, oh, everything causes cancer. Yes, everything does in fact cause cancer. But some things cause cancer faster than others, right? Like, tobacco is really good at causing cancer, and sunlight is really good at causing cancer. Hormones, like hormonal supplements that you've maybe heard of, like anabolic steroids, those are also pretty good at causing cancer. Because of, not so much because they interact with the DNA, but because of the things they do with cell signaling. They cause cells to divide more often, also. So, there are some things that, like, oh, they cause cancer. Like, oh, coffee has been, like, loosely associated with cancer. Coffee probably... I mean, yes, coffee causes cancer, but like not more than like oxygen. Probably less than oxygen, actually. But don't stop breathing. And even alcohol isn't super likely to cause cancer, as long as you keep it like 2 drinks or less per day. I think maybe guys, because we're bigger, can get away with 3. So as long as you're not like heavy drinking, it's not like super likely to cause cancer. 4 drinks a day, though, and you're like, okay, yeah, you could get liver cancer. So if you're going to drink alcohol, be reasonable with it. So I did simplify when I said there's like the go proteins and the stop proteins. So one thing that will tell a cell to stop dividing is like they're all next to each other, right? So like if you've got 2 cells next to each other and this one dies, well then this one's like, oh no, my buddy's gone. I need to fill the space, so I'll divide and make a new one. So cancer sort of turns that off, right? The chemical signaling that is involved in that pathway. Cancer will be like, I'm going to divide even if... I don't have a third hand. I'm going to divide even if there's a cell there. And that's why tumors are hard, is because they're like, I'm going to continue dividing even though it's a crowded space. Because normal cells don't divide when it's crowded. Another thing that can happen is telomeres. You've probably heard of telomeres. It's pretty fancy in like aging research. So if DNA is a string, then each piece of DNA has 2 ends, right? And those ends are called telomeres. Now those are mostly just junk DNA. It's DNA that's not super helpful. It doesn't have the instructions for any proteins. But the thing is, like, every time DNA divides, the ends get frayed a little bit. So you don't want that fraying to, like, cut into the instructions for your protein. So you have, like, a little bit of extra DNA on either side of the DNA string. So, one of the things a cancer cell can do... So in a normal cell, every time a cell divides, those ends get a little bit shorter. And when, like, there's no more telomere on the end of the DNA string, chromosome is the right way to say that. When there's no more telomeres on the end of the chromosome, the cell stops dividing. That's senescence, which I think I talked about already. That's one way that senescence can happen. So, a cancer cell will either turn senescence off, or will start making a protein start making a protein called telomerase, which usually adults don't have a whole lot of. And telomerase will make those ends longer. So when people say, like, oh, we could achieve immortality, because aging is, like, basically your telomeres getting shorter. So, like, every cell has, like, a certain number of times that it can divide before it can't divide anymore. I think it's, like, 20-ish for the average human cell. Adult human cell. So when most of your cells have run out of divisions, that's when you're old. But cancer cells have developed this special ability to not run out of times that they can divide. And some people will say, like, oh, we could cure aging if we could just, like, make our telomeres not get shorter. But it's like, no, our telomeres are supposed to get shorter, otherwise we'll get cancer. So if we're going to make ourselves immortal by messing with our DNA, we're going to have to try a little bit harder than that. Because imagine a tumor or a cancer cell, not a tumor yet, that has figured everything out, it's dividing super rapidly, except it only has like a finite number of times it can divide and then just stops. And then you don't actually get a tumor, you just get like a couple cancer cells that are no longer dividing, that are basically harmless. One way we protect ourselves against cancer, it was with something called a killer T cell. Killer T cells will kill our own cells if they start looking like they might be cancer. So one thing that a cancer cell has to do is not look like cancer to a T cell, right? So if you want to be a good criminal, you have to hide from the cops. So hopefully you're getting this idea that a number of genes have to mutate, and these genes are called oncogenes. That's why cancer doctors are like oncologists. So these oncogenes Like, a couple different ones have to be mutated before you eventually get, like, a full-blown type of cancer that's gonna kill you. And this seems unlikely, right? Because mutations are random events, and most mutations aren't bad. But you have 1 billion cells, and they're all not all of them are dividing, but most of them are dividing. And eventually, if you live like 80 years, you only need one that manages to be successful. And the other thing with that is you've probably heard of, like, antibiotic resistance in bacteria. Well, if that one successful cell starts dividing out of control and there's a lot of it, it'll still be mutating. So it can also get resistance, right? Like, if you try a certain type of chemotherapy, kills like 99% of the cells, but then like that 1% start dividing, and now they're immune to that type of chemotherapy. Congratulations. Which is also why, if you have a cancer diagnosis, a lot of times the doctors will never say you're completely cured, because there might be just one cell that could come back and form tumors all over your body again. How are you going to scan the whole body for one cell when there are billions of them and they're all really small? Hopefully that answered your question, and hopefully you'll never smoke.